Sometimes something cool comes along but doesn't take off or even get down the runway. Linkage forks are an example of this, so what are they and why aren't we all riding them? So what's wrong with a regular telescopic suspension fork? Why do we need anything else? They're used on almost every bike out there, so they can't be that bad. Well, they do dive under braking. This is the same effect you get as you hit a compression or land a drop. As you get deeper into your fork travel, your wheelbase gets shorter, your head angle gets steeper, and your bike gets less stable, not what you need when you're hitting the rough stuff. Aside from that, stitching in the seals robs you of that supple, off-the-top feeling riders look for. You might not realise it, but as you put the force through your forks, the stanchions bend. This causes binding and is part of the reason fork diameters have been on the rise. In theory, linkage forks should separate all those different forces acting on the front end of your bike. Just like the frame designers work on rear suspension linkages to isolate things like pedalling and braking forces, we should be able to do that with our forks. This all sounds great, so why didn't they take off? Linkage forks have been around a while, been revisited numerous times, but never stuck around. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, suspension forks were developing. You had RockShox and Manitou heading up the development race, their telescopic designs being derivative of Mototech at the time. But during this primitive era of suspension design, tolerances in manufacturing were still a tad loose, and overall designs were, let's just say, under development. Stiction, seal quality, flex, and poor overall reliability plagued telescopic bicycle forks. One of the first designs to come to light was the brainchild of Mert Lorwill, the Lorwill Leader fork. In production from 1991 to 93, with the first iterations being put together by Mert in his garage. Constructed from steel with an old coil shock, these then went on to be made from aluminium with a Ricci air shock. The mechanical linkage design allowed for 3 inches of travel, whilst retaining the same trail. Then you had the AMPF1 fork from Horst Leitner. You recognise the name? Yes, the Australian engineer responsible for the Horst link. That's still commonplace across a lot of full sus bikes, but the fork in question features a rather cool design which mimics the telescopic fork's axle path, but allowing the fork to run a cable-operated cantilever rim brake by moving all the hardware to the top of the fork. Damping taken care by 2 tiny little shocks horizontally mounted either side of the linkage arms, and it featured a rather stiff spring suspending from under the steerer tube. An amazing bit of engineering, however, having that many moving parts in a prime location to catch mud and debris meant they took a lot of maintenance to keep them running sweet. Then you had the Gervin fork, another Mototech derivative. The fork that found itself bolted into a bicycle had a stiffer chassis than a lot of telescopic forks at the time, and its rearward J-axle path could be adjusted to follow 1 or 2 movements, one more linear than the other. The dual-link design damped by a big yellow elastomer, but like the other 2 forks I've mentioned, it took a fair bit of maintaining. And if I'm talking linkage forks, I can't forget the white PRST1. Initial design's been engineered out of Meccano on an airport table amidst a typhoon, and the whole thing being named after the mechanical dog from Wallace and Gromit. Initially conceptualised by Adrian Ward and John White, it was then pitched and rejected by Marion. They decided to press on and release the bike under their own banner, White. The bike actually had some success, with just under 3,000 units being produced and the platform racking up some race wins. Developments were underway for the next iteration of White, but unfortunately, telescopic forks had got it together and eliminated some of the problems that linkage designs had been engineered to rid. What about more recent iterations? So you've got the Lauf Grit. It uses glass fibre or carbon leaf springs. It suspends the front wheel behind the leading edge of the fork blades. No hydraulic dampers, adjustment dials or air springs present. Lighter than other contemporary gravel forks, yes, I said the gravel word, providing better traction than a rigid fork, but not an all-out fork for gnar. And then you've got the trust message and the shout, the cumulative effort of Dave Weigel, Jason Shears and Hap Siegler. The shout's constructed from carbon, so full carbon steerer, legs and linkages. These particular designs offered increased small bump sensitivity and reduced dive under braking versus a telescopic fork. However, whilst being stiff fore and aft, it did suffer from a lack of torsional stiffness, so steering inputs could be a bit delayed versus contemporary telescopic forks. As well as this, they came with a hefty price tag, making them unattainable to some. In a world where telescopic suspension forks are king, the aesthetics were a bit divisive, if not a bit challenging. Then you've got the Motion E18, one of the most recent linkage fork designs. It makes use of a damper in one leg and a carbon leaf spring in the other. The lack of an air spring, like with a coil shock, makes the fork super supple and have a great small bump sensitivity. This design actually pulling on the carbon leaf. It's said though that setup on these forks can be a tad tricky, getting everything balanced is quite hard, and that lack of dive is an interesting one to get used to if you're coming from a traditional telescopic fork. And to round this out, we've got the Structure SCW1. A complete bike like the PRST1, now this actually got slacker as you go through the front end's travel. The front and rear have matched leverage ratios for a balanced ride. Sounds sweet, but if you go after one of these, you would be tying yourself into something very, very proprietary. Whilst the pivot bearings are replaceable, there are 8 of them, then 6 for steering, and a spherical one that allows everything to work together. So what really killed the linkage fork? It comes down to a few things. So setup was difficult. While it can be hard finding the sweet spot on telescopic forks, most riders can get things working reasonably well, reasonably easily. Because of the complexity of them, they're also quite spendy. That's not to say telescopic forks aren't either, as it's not uncommon to see a top-of-the-range forks going north of £2,000. However, whilst there are cheaper options on the market for telescopic forks, there weren't any for linkage models. That complexity also adds a lot more weight, which, while some designs use exotic materials with a lot of machining to trim off the fat, they're still heavier than a telescopic setup. And lastly, aesthetics. We're quite a fussy bunch when it comes to looks, not to mention quite resistant to change, so they're always going to have an uphill battle. Big brands doubled down on the telescopic fork, choosing to invest in these despite their shortcomings at the time, making them the norm at the turn of the millennium. And even now, in the pursuit of performance, new telescopic designs include more bushing overlap and improved damping to overcome the issues you get with stitching and flex. You've got larger diameter and heavier stanchions. They're the norm now, with top-of-the-line enduro forks like Fox 38s and RockShop Zebs both using 38mm stanchions. Having made a linkage fork an outsider, is it this rareness that makes us screw up our faces when we see one? Like I've said, these modern iterations actually had some merits. Things like a tunable axle path and minimising brake dive should be positives. So we need to rethink these forks. Boutique brands like Intend have been experimenting with upside-down forks to try and overcome some of the inherent issues with telescopic forks. And Fox have now joined the party with the Podium upside-down forks, where one brand goes, the other ones are likely to follow. So, I mean, we might see RockShox doing upside-down at some point. The real question, though, is whether instead of playing around with more or less the same formula, should they turn over a new leaf and give linkage forks another try? If one of the big players decided to develop one, would you want to run it? Or would the looks be enough to put you off? Let me know what you think. Would you like one of these linkage forks to make a proper comeback, or are you firmly in the telescopic fork camp? Let me know down in the comments. This is GMBN Tech, and I'll see you soon.